one of America's most iconic cities, the beating heart of finance, innovation, and culture, just changed direction completely. Zoran Mamdani, a self-described democratic socialist, has been elected mayor of New York City. Some are calling it a revolution. Others are calling it an economic disaster waiting to happen. But beneath the headlines lies something much bigger, a shift that could rewrite how American cities function, how wealth moves, and even how power itself is distributed. So today, let's unpack what this really means, not just for New York, but for every one of us. There are moments in history where you can feel the ground shifting beneath your feet. Election night was one of those moments. The polls had closed across New York City, and despite all the early predictions suggesting this would be a close race that might favor the establishment candidate, something unexpected was unfolding. Voter turnout was remarkably high, not just high in the usual sense, but specifically among younger voters and progressive activists who'd been energized by a message that promised to turn the system upside down. Now, I want you to picture this scene for a moment. Throughout the day, there were reports of irregularities at polling stations. Some locations experienced what they call swatting. Those are false threats called in to create chaos and potentially discourage people from voting. Several sites in areas known for leaning more conservative received bomb threats via email. Law enforcement was investigating whether these incidents were designed to suppress certain voters. Meanwhile, thousands of New Yorkers were posting photos of their ballots online, pointing out something curious. Mamdani's name appeared twice on many ballots, while his opponent's name showed up only once, tucked away in the bottom right corner. Whether this was intentional design or bureaucratic oversight, it became a talking point that fed into a larger narrative about fairness and manipulation. But here's what really caught everyone's attention. The early voting numbers told a story that political analysts are still trying to fully understand. In the previous mayoral race, just a few years earlier, roughly 170,000 people had voted early. This time, over 700,000. That's more than 4 times the previous number. And when you looked at the demographics, something fascinating emerged. About 60% of these early voters were over 44 years old, not exactly. Mamdani's core base of enthusiastic young progressives. This suggested that perhaps the opposition was more motivated than anyone realized, coming out in force to try to prevent exactly what ended up happening. Yet despite this surge in older, presumably more moderate voters, Mamdani still won. Think about that for a second. It means his coalition of younger voters, combined with working-class New Yorkers frustrated with the status quo, managed to overcome what should have been a significant disadvantage. This wasn't just an election, it was a statement. A ripple in New York that could soon become a wave across America. So what drove this unexpected rise? To truly understand Mamdani's victory, you have to understand the anger beneath it. And I'm not talking about the kind of anger that flares up and fades away. This is the deep, simmering frustration that builds over years of watching the same promises made and broken, the same faces cycling through power, the same sense that the system works for everyone except you. Think back to how you felt during different moments of change in your own lifetime. Maybe you remember the 1970s, when New York City was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Garbage piled up in the streets, crime was rampant. The city that had once symbolized American possibility felt like it was falling apart. People were desperate for something, anything, to change. That desperation creates openings for outsiders who promise to tear down and rebuild. Or perhaps you remember 2016, when another outsider, Donald Trump, rode a wave of anti-establishment fury all the way to the White House. People across America, particularly in places that felt forgotten by coastal elites, decided they'd rather take a chance on chaos than continue with what they saw as a rigged game. Mamdani tapped into that exact same energy, just from the opposite direction. He positioned himself as the anti-Trump in an anti-Trump town. Where Trump attacked government regulations and championed business, Mamdani attacked corporate greed and championed government intervention. Where Trump spoke to rural and suburban frustration, Mamdani spoke to urban and working-class frustration. But the emotional core was identical, the sense that ordinary people have been left behind, while those at the top play by different rules. When you're a young person in New York City paying over half your income for a cramped apartment, working multiple jobs just to stay afloat, watching billionaires get richer while you struggle to save anything well, someone promising to freeze your rent and tax the wealthy starts to sound pretty appealing, doesn't it? But here's the catch, and this is where we need to shift from emotion to mathematics. Winning on emotion is easy, governing on math is hard. And the math facing New York City right now? It's brutal. Let me walk you through some numbers, not to bore you, but because they tell a story that everyone needs to understand. New York City's budget depends heavily on a relatively small number of very high earners. We're talking about the top 1 or 2% of taxpayers contributing somewhere around 40 to 50% of the city's total tax revenue. Now, you might think, good, let them pay their share. And there's certainly an argument to be made about fairness and contribution. But here's the problem, and this is where ideology crashes into reality. Those high earners are mobile. They can leave. And increasingly, they are. Think of it like this. Imagine you're running a small town where most of your budget comes from 10 families. They pay for the schools, the roads, the police, the fire department. Now imagine you tell those 10 families that you're going to double their property taxes while also making their lives more difficult in various ways. More regulations, more restrictions. Maybe you freeze their ability to raise rents on properties they own. Perhaps you even talk about defunding the police that keep their neighborhoods safe. What do you think happens? Some of them start looking at the map and noticing there are other towns nearby with lower taxes, better services, and friendlier attitudes toward people with resources. This isn't theoretical. Economists across the political spectrum, liberal, conservative, and everything in between, have studied this pattern for decades. When you raise taxes beyond a certain threshold, especially in places where people have options to relocate, you trigger what they call tax flight. And here's the insidious part. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not like everyone packs up and leaves on the same day. Instead, it's gradual. A few families here, a few businesses there. A hedge fund moves its headquarters to Texas. A tech company decides to expand in Florida instead of Manhattan. A successful entrepreneur quietly changes his residency to Tennessee. Each individual departure might not seem like a big deal. But remember that math we talked about when the top % or 2 are funding roughly half your budget. Losing even a relatively small number of them creates a massive hole in your finances. And it's not just the direct tax revenue. These are the people who donate to charities, who spend money at restaurants and shops, who employ others. When they leave, they take entire ecosystems with them. One commentator described the impact of losing just one particularly wealthy individual. We're talking about someone who had been the single largest charitable donor in his city, contributing to everything from art museums to homeless shelters. When he relocated to another state because of tax policy, it created a gap in the city budget measured in the tens of millions of dollars. Suddenly, the charities that depended on his generosity had to cut programs. The cultural institutions had to scale back, and the government had to either raise taxes on everyone else to fill the gap or cut services. Either way, everyone ended up worse off. Now, I want to be clear about something, because this is where these discussions often go off the rails. This isn't about defending billionaires or saying wealthy people shouldn't pay taxes. That's not the point at all. The point is understanding cause and effect. Understanding that when you're making policy, you have to account for how people will actually respond, not how you wish they would respond. You can argue all day about what's fair and what people should do, but if your policies are based on what people should do rather than what they will do, you're setting yourself up for disaster. And, according to the data, that exodus has already begun. Before Mamdani even took office, surveys were showing that somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million New Yorkers, we're talking about roughly 1 in every 8 or 9 residents, were seriously considering leaving the city. Not just daydreaming about it, but actively making plans, looking at real estate in other states, calculating the cost savings, talking to their employers about remote work arrangements. Another survey found that about a quarter of New Yorkers would consider leaving depending on how things unfold over the next year or two. Now, will all of these people actually go? Probably not. There's always a gap between saying you'll do something and actually doing it. Moving is hard. Leaving behind friends, family, familiar places, that's a big decision. But even if only a fraction of these people follow through, we're talking about a significant population shift. And here's where it gets really interesting. These aren't random people leaving. The data shows that those most likely to relocate are exactly the ones the city can least afford to lose: educated professionals, successful business owners, people in their earning prime who've been paying the most in taxes. They're heading to very specific destinations. Florida, with its beaches and zero income tax. Texas, with its booming economy and low cost of living. Tennessee, where you can buy a house for a fraction of what a cramped apartment costs in Manhattan. When those moving vans roll out, they don't just take people, they take the city's lifeblood. Think about what happens next in this chain reaction. The tax base shrinks, so the city has less money. To make up the difference, they raise taxes on those who remain. But raising taxes makes more people want to leave, which shrinks the tax base further, which leads to more tax increases or service cuts, which makes even more people leave. It's a vicious cycle, a feedback loop, that's very hard to stop once it gets momentum. And we've seen this movie before. This isn't speculation or theory. This is history repeating itself. Let me take you back to the 1970s. New York City was the financial capital of the world, the cultural center of America, the city that never sleeps, and it nearly died. The city had been spending far beyond its means for years, expanding services and payrolls, making promises to unions and voters that sounded great but weren't sustainable. When the economy hit a rough patch, the whole house of cards came tumbling down. The city couldn't pay its bills. It was literally on the verge of bankruptcy. You know what President Ford said at the time? The newspapers summarized his position with a headline that became infamous: Ford to city, drop dead. The federal government refused to bail out New York, forcing the city to make painful cuts and reforms. Crime skyrocketed. Services deteriorated. The middle class fled to the suburbs. Times Square became a symbol of urban decay, not the shiny tourist destination you might know today, but a dangerous zone of adult theaters and street crime that respectable people avoided. It took decades to recover from that collapse. It required fundamental reforms, new leadership, a complete reimagining of how the city operated. People like Rudy Giuliani in the 90s implemented policies, some controversial, but effective, that reduced crime, improved quality of life, and convinced businesses and residents that New York could be great again. By the 2000s and 2010s, the city had been reborn. Property values soared. The wealthy returned. New businesses flourished. The tax revenue that came with prosperity allowed the city to provide services that people in most of America could only dream of. But here's the thing about prosperity: it's fragile. It depends on confidence, on people believing that if they invest in a place, work hard, build something, they'll be able to enjoy the fruits of that labor. When you start implementing policies that feel punitive towards success, that confidence erodes, and once it erodes, it's very hard to rebuild. This is what worries economists when they hear proposals like rent freezes. On the surface, freezing rent sounds compassionate, doesn't it? If you're a renter, and most New Yorkers are, the idea that your landlord can't raise your rent for 4 years sounds like a lifeline. Finally, some stability. Some protection against being priced out of your own neighborhood. I understand that appeal, I really do. But let's think through what happens next. If you're a landlord and maybe you're not some faceless corporation, maybe you're someone who bought a building as an investment for retirement, your costs don't freeze. Property taxes keep going up. Maintenance costs keep going up. Insurance keeps going up. Heating, water, repairs, all of it keeps getting more expensive. But your income from rent is frozen, so what do? Well, you have a few options, none of them good. You can defer maintenance, let things slide, don't fix what isn't immediately broken, hope nothing major goes wrong. You can try to find other ways to squeeze revenue, maybe charging fees for things that used to be included. Or you can just decide this investment isn't worth it anymore and sell to whoever is willing to take the risk, probably a large corporation that has the resources to wait out the freeze. Or maybe you just let the building deteriorate until it's not worth owning. Now multiply that decision by thousands of property owners across the city. What happens to the housing stock? It ages, it declines. Fewer new apartments get built because who wants to invest in a market where the government can arbitrarily freeze your revenue? The shortage of housing gets worse, not better. And here's the ultimate irony: when the rent freeze eventually ends, and it will end because nothing lasts forever, rents spike dramatically because there's even less supply, and landlords need to make up for years of losses. This pattern has played out in virtually every city that's tried aggressive rent control. Economists have studied it extensively. They've even compared it to trying to stop the ocean tide by building a wall. You might hold it back temporarily, but the pressure builds, and eventually, something gives. One economist described a proposed rent freeze as a hydrogen bomb for the local real estate market. Not a small bomb, not a firecracker, a hydrogen bomb. That's the level of disruption we're talking about. So we're looking at a collision course between ideology and economics, between what sounds good and what actually works, between the emotional satisfaction of sticking it to landlords and the practical reality that housing is a market, and markets follow rules, whether we like those rules or not. And here's where the story expands beyond just New York City, because what happens locally connects to something much larger happening nationally. While New Yorkers were dealing with ballot confusion and election drama, something equally significant was unfolding across the country in California. The federal government announced they were launching a criminal investigation into Governor Gavin Newsom's Proposition 50, a redistricting measure that critics claimed was designed to manipulate electoral maps in favor of Democrats for the upcoming midterm elections. But the investigation wasn't focused on the redistricting itself. It was focused on how the voting was conducted. The White House said they had evidence that mail-in ballots were being sent to people who weren't eligible to vote specifically, that ballots were going out under the names of individuals who weren't legally registered or who weren't citizens. Under federal law, that's postal fraud. It's a serious crime that can result in prison time, fines, and in the case of non-citizens, deportation. The administration's press secretary explained that under their universal mail-in system, California had created conditions where fraud wasn't just possible but likely. Now, whether the investigation finds actual widespread fraud remains to be seen, but the announcement itself, the timing of it on Election Day for other races around the country, sent a clear message. It fed into a narrative that's been growing for years now, that our election systems can't be trusted, that somebody somewhere is always trying to game the results, that the outcomes we see don't reflect what voters actually wanted. Think about what this does to the foundation of democracy. The whole system depends on a basic agreement. We compete for votes, we count them fairly, the side that gets more votes wins, and everyone accepts the outcome even if they're disappointed. That's the deal that makes peaceful transitions of power possible. But what happens when substantial portions of the population on both sides believe the system is rigged against them? Trump supporters spent years claiming the 2020 election was stolen through various forms of fraud and manipulation. Now progressive activists are claiming that investigations into mail-in voting are politically motivated attempts at voter suppression. When Mamdani was asked about the polling station incidents in New York, the bomb threats, the swatting, he immediately blamed the Trump administration, saying it was part of their general approach to intimidate voters and undermine democracy. But here's the fascinating thing. Trump and Mamdani, despite being polar opposites politically, are actually using the same playbook. Both position themselves as outsiders fighting a corrupt establishment. Both claim the system is rigged. Both rely heavily on emotional polarization, on making their supporters feel that the other side isn't just wrong, but dangerous, illegitimate, and existential threat to everything good and decent. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. If every side calls the other illegitimate, who's left to believe in the system? If Republicans say Democratic victories are fraudulent and Democrats say Republican victories are suppressed, where does that leave us? Can democracy function when nobody trusts the scoreboard? I don't have an easy answer to that question, but I know it's one of the most important questions facing our country right now. Because while politicians on both sides argue about who's undermining democracy more, there are real-world consequences playing out in people's everyday lives. And those consequences don't care about ideology. Let me bring this back down to earth, to the level where most of us actually live. Because whatever grand theories are being debated in political circles, what matters to regular people is whether they can afford their lives, whether their neighborhoods are safe, whether the city or town they call home is improving or declining. When you chase wealthy taxpayers out of a city through aggressive taxation and hostile policies, you might feel a sense of moral victory. You might feel like you're finally making the rich pay their fair share. But then what actually happens? Empty storefronts where thriving businesses used to be, reduced hours at libraries because there's not enough money for staff, longer waits for police response because the department had to cut officers, potholes that don't get filled, parks that don't get maintained. all the unglamorous but essential functions of a city that require money to operate. There's a saying you've probably heard: you can't tax your way to prosperity. Another version: when you rob Peter to pay Paul, you can always count on Paul's support. The question is, what happens when Peter leaves town? Paul might support the policy, but there's nobody left to rob, so Paul doesn't get paid after all. Remember how I mentioned earlier what Giuliani accomplished in the 90s? When he took office, New York was still recovering from that 70s collapse. Crime was still high. Quality of life was poor. He implemented what they called broken windows policing, the idea that if you address small signs of disorder, you prevent bigger problems from developing. He worked with the business community rather than against them. He focused on making the city work, not on grand ideological statements. Were all his policies perfect? No. Did everyone support his approach? Absolutely not. But the results were undeniable. Crime fell dramatically. The city became safer. Businesses invested. Property values rose. Tax revenue increased, which allowed better services, which made more people want to live there, which increased tax revenue further. A virtuous cycle instead of a vicious one. Now, those gains risk being reversed. When you talk about defunding police in a city that remembers what high crime feels like, you're playing with fire. When you vilify the business community that employs hundreds of thousands of people, you're sawing off the branch you're sitting on. The ideology might feel good, might score points with your base, but the consequences are measured in people's safety, livelihoods, and opportunities. And this speaks to something even deeper than economics or policy. This speaks to a battle over America's fundamental identity. Are we a country that rewards innovation and risk-taking and success, or are we a country that views success with suspicion and seeks to redistribute outcomes? Are we about equality of opportunity or equality of result? About independence and self-reliance, or about collective responsibility and mutual dependence? About trusting markets to allocate resources or trusting governments to allocate them? These aren't new questions. Americans have been arguing about them since the founding, but the volume has gotten much louder, and the stakes feel much higher. Mamdani's rent-freeze rhetoric and his promises of government-run grocery stores and free public transit connect with young people who feel like capitalism has failed them, who look at their economic prospects compared to their parents' generation and see a raw deal. That frustration is real and legitimate. But here's what often gets lost. The proposals being offered as solutions ignore the lessons of history. Rent control has been tried repeatedly and failed repeatedly. Government-run enterprises have a track record of inefficiency and waste. Price controls create shortages. These aren't conservative talking points, they're observations about how complex systems actually function. When you try to overrule basic economic realities through sheer force of will or legislation, reality tends to win. Think of it like trying to make water flow uphill because you've decided that's where it should go. You can build pumps, create elaborate systems, spend enormous resources fighting against gravity, or you can work with gravity, channel the water where it naturally wants to go, and use that energy productively. One approach is exhausting and expensive and ultimately futile. The other works with reality instead of against it. This is the fundamental clash we're witnessing between idealism that refuses to accept constraints and pragmatism that works within them. Between the belief that if we just want something badly enough and try hard enough, we can override economic laws, and the understanding that those laws exist whether we acknowledge them or not. So where does this leave the rest of us watching from outside New York? Why should someone in Iowa or Arizona or Oregon care about who the mayor of New York City is? Because what happens in New York doesn't stay in New York. These migration patterns we've been discussing, the movement of people and wealth from high-tax blue states to low-tax red states, are redrawing the American map. Texas has gained somewhere around 700,000 or 800,000 new residents in recent years. Florida has imported close to $1 trillion in income from people relocating from other states over a decade. That's an enormous transfer of economic power. When companies decide where to expand or relocate, they're looking at these patterns. The fact that Texas now has its own stock exchange challenging New York's century-old dominance, that's not symbolic. That represents a genuine shift in where financial power is concentrating. When businesses make those moves, they take jobs with them, they take tax revenue, they take innovation and energy and opportunity, And here's the political dimension. Congressional representation and electoral votes are based on population. States that are losing people lose political power. States that are gaining people gain it. After the next census, we could see several seats shift from places like New York and California to places like Texas and Florida. The map of American political power is being redrawn not by politicians, but by millions of individual decisions about where to live and work. This could be the beginning of a new American map drawn not by borders, but by belief systems. States that embrace certain policies attract certain types of people, which reinforces those policies, which attracts more like-minded people. States that embrace different policies see the opposite effect. Over time, we're self-selecting into increasingly distinct regional cultures with different values, different economies, different futures. Is that good or bad? I suppose it depends on your perspective. On one hand, it means people have options. If you don't like how your state is run, you can move somewhere more aligned with your values. That's a kind of freedom. On the other hand, it reduces the shared national experience, the sense that we're all in this together despite our differences. It makes it easier to demonize the other side when they live somewhere else, and you rarely encounter them. And that brings us to the big question, what happens next? I see two possible paths forward, and both have historical precedent. The first path is what I'll call collapse and recovery. If New York follows the trajectory that economic fundamentals suggest, if the tax base continues shrinking, if businesses keep leaving, if services deteriorate and crime increases, then at some point, reality forces a reckoning. The city hits bottom. Maybe it faces another fiscal crisis, like the 70s. Maybe it requires outside intervention, federal bailouts, emergency measures. That sounds terrible, and it would be terrible for the people living through it. But history shows that sometimes hitting bottom creates the conditions for real reform. When the pain becomes undeniable, when the old approaches have clearly failed, people become willing to try something different. New leadership emerges. Pragmatic solutions replace ideological purity. The city rebuilds on a more sustainable foundation. It takes years, maybe decades, but recovery is possible. The second path is what I'll call adaptation and reinvention. Maybe, and this requires some optimism, maybe the new leadership recognizes the constraints they're operating under and finds creative ways to achieve their goals without destroying the foundation. Maybe they figure out how to provide more affordable housing without rent freezes that backfire. Maybe they find ways to improve services without taxing people out of the city. Maybe they prove that progressive policies can actually work if implemented thoughtfully rather than ideologically. I'll be honest with you, I'm skeptical of that second path based on the rhetoric and proposals we've heard, but I've been surprised before. Sometimes people govern differently than they campaign. Sometimes reality has a way of moderating extreme positions once you're actually responsible for outcomes. So I'm not ruling it out. I'm just saying the historical odds aren't encouraging. Either way, the next few months will tell us a lot. Will the predicted exodus accelerate, or will people give the new leadership a chance? Will businesses start announcing relocations, or will they stay and adapt? Will crime trends continue downward or reverse? Will other progressive politicians in other cities look at New York and say, that's the model we should follow, or will they quietly distance themselves as problems emerge? We're standing at one of those turning points where ideology collides with reality, where what people want runs headlong into what's actually possible, where passion and anger and hope meet mathematics and incentives and human nature. Whether you agree with Mamdani or not, his victory tells us that people are demanding change, real or imagined. They're tired of being told to accept the way things are. They want someone to fight for them, to challenge the powerful, to promise that a better world is possible. That impulse is understandable. It's fundamentally human. The question is whether the change being offered will actually improve lives or whether it will repeat mistakes that history has already shown us don't work. The next few months will reveal if that change heals the system or breaks it for good. So let me know what you think. Is New York about to lead America into a new future or repeat the mistakes of the past? Does Mamdani represent a necessary corrective to decades of inequality or a dangerous experiment that will hurt the very people he claims to help? I'm genuinely curious how you see this playing out. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you value this kind of independent analysis that tries to look beyond the headlines and understand the deeper currents shaping our world. And subscribe so we can keep decoding what's next together, because I promise you, this story is just getting started. The decisions made in the coming months in New York City will echo across the country for years to come. Let's make sure we understand what's really happening, not just what we're told is happening. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.